Pick those up, sweetheart. Temps don't get to question real doctors. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 hours before 50 Marines would form a corridor to the apartment of the woman kneeling at his feet. Cedar Creek Medical's ICU smells like disinfectant and floor wax under flickering fluorescent lights that hum at a frequency designed to make humans feel subtly wrong. Rachel Torres notices these details the way most people notice traffic lights, her eyes tracking medication drip rates and monitor rhythms while her hands move through vital checks with the kind of steadiness that comes from having already survived the worst. She is 29, brunette, compact, with a hairline scar above her left eyebrow and a slight limp favoring her right leg that appears only at hour 11 of her shifts when the pain medication wears off. In her locker, wrapped in plastic and buried beneath her street clothes, sits a pair of worn combat boots, size 11 men's, the left one still carrying dust from Marger in the tread. She has been at Cedar Creek for 6 days as a temp nurse, assigned to the ICU's veteran wing, her credentials listing 3 years at Atlanta General and a nursing degree from a program that exists only on paper and in a classified NCIS file. Her badge says Rachel T. RN. It does not say what she actually is. Room 347 holds retired Marine General Vincent Hayes, admitted 72 hours ago with atrial fibrillation that the cardiologists cannot quite control. Rachel has memorized his file, 2 tours in Helmand Province, decorated at Kandahar, commanded the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines during the Marger offensive in 2010. The man whose face she recognizes from a different context entirely. Her actual context. The one she came here to watch. She checks his full line with practiced efficiency, notes his heart rhythm stable on the monitor, and sees Dr. Whitfield entering the unit for morning rounds, his white coat crisp as fresh money, his smile sharp as broken glass, his eyes already scanning the ward for weakness like a predator reading blood in water. Rachel continues her charting. She does not look up. Rachel. His voice carries across the nurse's station, dropping her name like an insult. She knows what's coming. She has known since yesterday, when she corrected his dosage calculation on a veteran patient's digoxin order and he'd smiled that smile and said nothing. The silence had been worse than yelling. The silence had been a threat. Come here for a moment. I want the residents to understand something about your credentials. She stands. She walks to the station. The other nurses pretend they cannot hear him, but they are all listening. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like angry wasps. Dr. Whitfield places his hands flat on the counter and leans forward, his voice dropping to a register that somehow carries farther than a shout. You're a temp from an Atlanta hospital that closed 7 years ago. Your references are difficult to reach. And yesterday you thought you understood cardiac pharmacology better than someone who went to Columbia Medical School. He pauses. His eyes move across her face, looking for a flinch, a reddening, anything. So here's what I want you to understand. You are not a doctor. You will never be a doctor. You're a temp filling a gap, and once you realize that people like you don't advance in a place like this, you'll quit just like the other 3 did. Pick your floor. Pick your patients. Do your job. He picks up her patient charts, all 7 of them, and drops them onto the counter from 6 inches up. They scatter. Stay in your lane, sweetheart. The room goes quiet. Someone's monitor beeps. And 4 pump hisses. Rachel's jaw clenches once, barely visible, a muscle flexing beneath the skin. Her hands remain steady. They have to. Hands that shake cannot place a needle. Hands that shake cannot hold a bleeding soldier. She moves toward the scattered charts without waiting for him to finish, already on her knees, already gathering them with the kind of efficiency that suggests she has been gathering things from the floor her entire professional life. But that wasn't the worst part. Oh, and one more thing. Whitfield's voice comes from above her, theatrical, designed for the resident physicians clustered near the medication dispensary. This morning, over breakfast, I made a little wager. I'm betting you don't last 7 more days. Anyone want in? The residents laugh, nervous laughter, the kind you make when you're not sure if something is cruel or funny but you don't want to find out. Rachel continues gathering her charts. She does not look up. She does not respond. She is on her knees in front of a man who has no idea that she has kneeled in worse places, in conditions that would make the ICU look like a day spa. She has kneeled in desert compounds while rounds snapped overhead. She has kneeled beside dying soldiers trying to stop bleeding that would not stop. This is nothing. This is air. She returns to her charting station and arranges the charts in order: room 340, 341, 342, 343, 344, 346, 347. General Hayes in the last slot, his file slightly thicker than the others. Room 347 is where her mission lives. Room 347 is why she is here taking this, all of this, why she is a temp nurse in Philadelphia instead of back at her desk at NCIS headquarters in Quantico. 6 months ago, 2 veteran patients died in this ICU. Both died from medication errors. Both errors traced back to standing orders written by one physician. Both errors could have been accidents. Neither was. She has 17 pages of documentation for witness statements and a chain of evidence that currently points to negligence. She needs proof of intent. She needs to watch him work. She needs him to make another mistake while she is in the room, while she can document it, while she can stop it before someone else dies. The cafeteria incident happens at lunch, exactly as Rachel has learned to predict these things. Dr. Whitfield enters the lunch line behind her, his tray already filled with salad and grilled chicken, his posture relaxed because he is in his domain, his cathedral, his place where he is the authority and she is the temp. Rachel carries her tray, sandwich, apple, black coffee, the sparse meal of someone who spent 23 years learning to eat fast and survive on nothing, and Whitfield walks past her toward the salad bar. His left elbow bumps her tray as he passes. Not an accident. Not quite. The angle is too precise, the trajectory too deliberate. Her tray tilts. The sandwich slides. The apple rolls. The coffee spills across the stainless steel counter and onto the floor, spreading in a dark brown arc, hissing slightly as it hits the tile. The smell hits immediately: burnt coffee, the acrid reminder of 1,000 morning briefings in forward operating bases, the smell of staying awake because sleeping meant dying. "Oh, Jesus, I'm so sorry." Whitfield's voice is all apology now, theatrical apology, the kind that is designed to be heard by the cafeteria worker and the 2 residents standing 3 feet away. "I didn't see you there. You okay?" Rachel sets her tray down on a clean section of counter. She pulls paper towels from the dispenser. She begins cleaning up her own spill. The cafeteria worker tries to help. Rachel waves him off. She is on her knees again, cleaning up after herself, while Whitfield stands with his hands on his hips, shaking his head with the expression of a man who has just witnessed a minor tragedy. "You should be more careful in here," he says, his voice carrying concern like a weapon. "These things happen when you're tired. Have you been sleeping okay?" Rachel does not answer. She finishes cleaning. She throws away the paper towels. She walks to get a new sandwich from the line, and when she returns to the counter, Whitfield is already gone. He has won the exchange. He has established that he can knock her down and she will simply clean it up. He does not see what happens next, which is why he is still walking around with his medical license. That night, at 11:02 p.m., Rachel stands at her bathroom sink in her apartment in northeast Philadelphia, her hands gripping the edge of the porcelain with enough force that her knuckles turn white. The sink is old, chipped, the kind of sink that comes with a rental apartment on a Master Chief's salary that she cannot actually spend because she is supposed to be a temp nurse. She stares at her reflection in the mirror, the scarred eyebrow, the jaw set tight, the eyes that look older than 29 because they have seen things that only 30-year-olds are supposed to see. Her hands are shaking now. Not from fear. Not from shame. From restraint. From the feeling of combat instinct screaming beneath her scrubs, beneath her civilian clothes, beneath her skin, screaming that there is a threat in her environment and that threat needs to be neutralized and that she has the training to neutralize it and that nobody would ever question her if she did. She closes her eyes. She counts backwards from 10. She thinks about her 8-year-old son waiting for her at home, asking why mommy has to be a nurse at the hospital instead of being at her real job, asking when they can stay in one place long enough to plant a tree. She thinks about the 2 veteran patients who died because a man wanted to prove something about how much smarter he is than everyone else in the room. She thinks about the pair of boots in her locker, the ones that belonged to her son's father, the ones that came home in a box marked personal effects from a place she cannot discuss with civilians. And she lets the screaming settle. She lets the instincts quiet down. She becomes a temp nurse again, someone who picks things up off the floor and does not question physicians and does everything right so nobody ever suspects what is actually underneath the uniform. General Hayes is still awake when she does her midnight rounds. His monitor shows sinus rhythm, steady, his blood pressure holding at 128/71, his oxygen saturation at 98%. He is 86 years old and he has survived wars, and he is currently surviving Dr. Whitfield's care because his system is strong and because Rachel is watching. She checks his 4, confirms the line is clean, verifies the medication running on his pump matches his chart. Digoxin. 0.25 milligrams. The same drug she corrected Whitfield on. The same drug used incorrectly on 2 other veteran patients. She will watch this drug. She will watch every drop. The general opens his eyes as she finishes. "You're the new one," he says. His voice is rough, the voice of someone whose throat has been used up by years of shouting orders in dust and heat. "Yes, sir," Rachel says. She does not say her name. She does not say anything except what is necessary. "You're quiet," he says. I like that. Most people talk too much. Most people are scared and they fill the silence with noise. He closes his eyes again. The quiet ones are usually the ones who have already seen something worth shutting up for. Rachel does not respond. She finishes her rounds and moves to room 348, then 349, then 350, her hands moving through their checks with the precision of someone who has practiced placing needles in the dark, who has sewn wounds without anesthesia, who has learned that the smallest movements carry the most weight. The night shifts are long, but they are safe. The night shifts do not contain Dr. Whitfield. The night shifts contain only the patients, the machines, the hum of the ICU, and Rachel Torres, who is exactly who she appears to be and nothing more. Nobody knows. Not yet. Whitfield does not suspect that the temp nurse he knocked down is actually watching him. He does not know that she has 17 pages of documentation in a safe deposit box. He does not know that NCIS has a file open on his prescribing practices. He does not know that the woman he just publicly humiliated is the reason those 2 veteran patients are going to get justice. And he has absolutely no idea what happens in 48 hours, when General Vincent Hayes's heart stops and the quiet temp nurse in the ICU saves his life in a way that will change everything. The morning rounds at Cedar Creek Medical started like every other morning, but this time Dr. Whitfield had an audience he'd carefully cultivated. For residents in pristine white coats flanked him as he approached the nurse's station, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry across the ICU. $20 says the temp quits by Friday. He smiled, that practice smile that made his mouth move without touching his eyes. These quiet ones always crack when you give them real responsibility. It's beautiful, really, like watching dominoes fall. Rachel stood at the medication cart, her hands arranging vials in alphabetical order, each movement precise and deliberate. She didn't look up. One of the residents laughed, a nervous, approval-seeking sound. Whitfield handed her a stack of updated care protocols, each page stamped with his signature, each one contradicting the overnight note she'd carefully documented. The papers felt heavy in her hands, not because of their weight but because of what they represented, a public declaration that her clinical judgment had no value in this hospital. "Unless you have a medical degree I don't know about, sweetheart." His tone was the color of honey poured over broken glass. Rachel's jaw clenched for exactly 2 seconds. She felt the tension rise from her shoulders, that familiar surge of adrenaline that had kept her alive in Marja, the same autonomic response that made her hand steady when everything around her was chaos. She filed the protocols into the patient chart without responding. Her silence was a weapon, though Whitfield didn't know it yet. The residents exchanged glances, uncertain whether the temp nurse had been adequately put in her place. Whitfield watched her face like a predator studying prey, looking for a crack, a tremor, something he could exploit further. He found nothing. That afternoon, the cafeteria smelled like industrial steam and chicken broth when Rachel approached the physician's table where Whitfield held court, gesturing with a sandwich in one hand. She held a patient chart open, her voice pitched low and professional. Dr. Whitfield, Mr. Hayes's renal labs from this morning show a creatinine of 2.4. She spoke to his shoulder, not his face, the exact deferential angle that hospital hierarchy demanded. The beta-blocker dosage in your new order may result in toxic accumulation. The labs are in the chart. For a moment, the table went silent. Other doctors began setting down their forks. Whitfield stood slowly, deliberately, his shoulders back. He was 8 inches taller than Rachel, and he used that height the way a lion uses its manet. Let me explain something about hospital hierarchy, Nurse Torres. He emphasized her title like she'd just confessed to a crime. His hand reached for his coffee cup in a movement that looked casual enough, but Rachel had trained in tactical awareness for 15 years. She saw the trajectory, the angle, the intent before his elbow connected. The cup was still in his hand when he bumped her tray. The motion was too theatrical to be accidental. Too slow. Too controlled. Her lunch scattered across the tile floor in an explosion of soup and sandwich and plastic container pieces. The puddle spread like a stain across her shoes. 12 staff members watched it happen. 3 residents laughed. Whitfield smiled that honey and broken glass smile. Oops. Temps should watch where they stand. Rachel knelt without hesitation, her hands gathering the debris with mechanical precision. Her peripheral vision tracked the security camera mounted in the corner. Yes, it had a clear angle on the physician's table. She noted the 3 residents who laughed, one of whom was writing in a small notebook, probably his daily journal or notes. She catalogued every detail because her mission required her to understand Whitfield's pattern, his enablers, his institutional leverage. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. Her face was as blank as a hospital wall. She was a statue wearing scrubs, and inside the statue was a Marine Master Chief Petty Officer with 2 silver stars and a Navy Cross, doing what she had always done, absorbing the hit without flinching, filing it away, moving forward. That evening, a formal written warning appeared in her mailbox, the paper still warm from the printer. The language was precise and bureaucratic, inappropriate challenges to physician authority in a public setting. Overstepping scope of practice. Insubordination. Copied to the nursing director and HR, copied to Whitfield's mentor on Cedar Creek's board, a retired orthopedic surgeon named Dr. Harrison Pierce who owed Whitfield favors stretching back to their medical school days. Pierce had placed Whitfield in the attending position 3 years ago, had written letters to the state medical board defending him against a patient safety complaint in 2019, had quietly ensured that any negative peer reviews never made it to official records. Whitfield's power wasn't just his title or his seniority. It was institutional. It was protected. It was woven into the hospital structure like steel reinforcement in concrete. Rachel read the warning in her car, the engine off, the Philadelphia rain beginning to hammer the windshield. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the steering wheel. She could feel her son waiting at home, Mrs. Chen from downstairs probably sitting with him in the living room, both of them watching the door. She drove with military precision, the speed limit, the correct lane, the careful turns of someone operating inside rigid parameters. At home, she made pasta with butter and herbs, helped Marcus with his spelling words, let him show her the drawing he'd made at school of the 2 of them standing in front of a house with a tree. "When can we stay somewhere for a long time?" he asked. Rachel brushed his hair back from his forehead. "Soon, baby. Maybe soon." She didn't tell him it depended on whether she could prove that Dr. Whitfield had systematically mismanaged medications in the veteran ward, resulting in 2 deaths that should never have occurred. She didn't tell him that her commanding officer had placed her here specifically because the official hospital investigations had been buried by hospital administration protecting their attending physicians. She put him to bed, waited until his breathing deepened, and then she stood at her bathroom sink. The mirror showed her a stranger wearing scrubs and exhaustion. Her hands gripped the counter until her reflection blurred. The sink was cold against her palms. In the open closet behind her, barely visible, was the pair of worn combat boots she couldn't bring herself to throw away, boots that had walked through Marja in 2010, boots that had carried her across the mountains of Paktia province, boots that had been on her feet when she carried Marcus's father through 300 meters of open ground while calling in air support to cover the extraction. Those boots reminded her who she actually was. Not a temp nurse. Not a woman who could be publicly humiliated in a cafeteria. Not someone who belonged at the bottom of a hierarchy. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the coiled tension of a warrior who had been taught not to break the very people hurting her. The next morning, Rachel found her patient chart scattered on the floor outside the supply room, organized in no particular order, some bent at the corners. A note was taped to the wall above the pile: "Pick those up, sweetheart, temps don't get to leave messes." She recognized Whitfield's handwriting from the warning letter. She knelt and collected them in silence, her movements economical and controlled, her mind already 3 moves ahead. She noted that he was escalating, moving from public humiliation to institutional sabotage, filing complaints, making calls. She had 72 hours, maybe less, before he would call the nursing director and ask about her credentials more formally. She knew this because she'd trained in interrogation resistance, because she understood escalation patterns, because she was reading Whitfield like a manual. He was predictable. Hospital hierarchy always was. It made men like him believe they were untouchable. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that her real mission, the reason she was actually at Cedar Creek Medical, required her to stay in place without revealing her hand. 2 veteran patients had died from medication errors in the past 4 months. Both deaths had been ruled expected complications from terminal diagnoses. Both families had accepted the explanations without questioning. But the medication discrepancies on their charts were too consistent, too similar, too much like a pattern rather than coincidence. And that pattern traced directly back to standing orders that Dr. Whitfield had instituted and defended against nursing objections for 18 months. Rachel needed to document those discrepancies herself. She needed to prove that Whitfield's orders were not just aggressive but reckless, not just outdated but dangerous. She needed General Hayes in room 347 to stay alive long enough for her to gather evidence from the veteran ward, and she needed Whitfield to believe she was just another temp who would eventually crack under pressure. So she picked up her scattered charts without a word, walked them to the ICU, and began her evening rounds with the precision of someone operating inside rules she had no intention of following for much longer. The phone call started at 0347, while the hospital corridors still hummed with that particular silence that belongs only to the deep night hours, when the dying and the living exist in separate worlds. Dr. Whitfield sat in his office with the door closed, the leather chair creaking beneath him like something wounded, his fingers moving across the phone screen with the precision of a man who'd spent 15 years learning exactly which strings to pull. The first call went to his mentor, Dr. Richard Bancroft, the retired surgeon who sat on Cedar Creek's board of directors and had shepherded Whitfield's career through 3 malpractice settlements and 1 internal affairs investigation. The phone rang twice before Bancroft's voice came through, thick with sleep and irritation. "It's 3 in the morning, Marcus. We have a problem. Temp nurse on the ICU floor, credentials appear fraudulent." Whitfield's voice carried the practiced calm of a man describing something he'd already decided was inevitable. "I need her references verified immediately." There was a pause. The kind of pause that meant Bancroft understood what was really being asked. "I'll make some calls." The second call went to the nursing director at Atlanta General Hospital, where Rachel's listed credentials claimed 7 years of surgical floor experience. The director's voicemail greeting, recorded by someone who'd never worked a day in an ICU, picked up on the 4th ring. Whitfield left a message requesting immediate verification of employment records for a Rachel Torres. He knew, before the call was even finished, what the answer would be. The listed references were ghosts. The credentials were architecture, beautiful on paper and utterly hollow underneath. By the time the third call connected, to Dr. James Castellano, a medical school classmate now working for the State Licensing Board in Harrisburg. The sun was still an hour from breaking. Castellano's irritation had transformed into something sharper, something that resembled interest. Fraudulent nursing credentials submitted to Cedar Creek Medical in Philadelphia, Whitfield said, each word placed like a brick in a wall. I'm compiling documentation for a formal complaint. When that paperwork lands, I wanted you aware. You're certain? I'm standing in my hospital at 3 in the morning because I'm certain. The calls formed a perimeter. By 0600, before the day shift arrived, Bancroft had pulled the board's institutional memory and discovered that Cedar Creek's personnel system had no independent verification mechanism for contracted temp workers. The burden fell entirely on the hiring agency. By 0700, the nursing director at Atlanta General had confirmed that no Rachel Torres had ever worked there, that the phone number listed on her application was registered to a burner account, and that the supervisor she'd named didn't exist. By 0800, Castellano had opened a formal investigation file and notified Cedar Creek's compliance officer that preliminary findings suggested credential fraud. The machinery of institutional power moved with the terrible efficiency of something well-oiled and utterly indifferent to the lives it crushed beneath its gears. There was a kind of genius in it, Rachel would later understand, in how Whitfield had weaponized the very systems meant to protect patients. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't threatened. He'd simply made phone calls to people who understood that protecting the hospital's reputation meant protecting physicians who brought prestige and billing revenue. The hospital's chief administrator, herself a former resident who'd worked under Whitfield and owed him recommendations that had shaped her career, received the compliance report at 0815. By 0830, Rachel's badge had been flagged in the system. Access restricted. Medication authorization locked. Patient file reviews disabled. The words appeared in red on every screen where her credentials were checked, a digital scarlet letter that preceded her into every room. She moved through her rounds on the general surgical floor, a reassignment that had been delivered to her at shift change without explanation, aware that something had shifted, that the carefully balanced structure of her cover was beginning to fracture along invisible seams. The new assignment placed her with post-operative patients who required basic wound care and vitals monitoring, away from the veteran ward, away from the medication documentation she'd been quietly photographing, away from General Hayes in room 347. It was strategic erasure disguised as routine staffing adjustment. When she'd asked the charge nurse why she'd been moved, the response came with a careful neutrality that meant everyone already knew the story that was circulating. She'd accessed files outside her scope, her credentials were being reviewed, she should expect a conversation with administration. The conversation came at 0855. A woman named Patricia Medina, the hospital's compliance director, sat across from Rachel in a small office that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and something vaguely antiseptic. Behind Medina's desk hung degrees from institutions Rachel recognized, Johns Hopkins, Yale, and a framed photograph of Medina shaking hands with Whitfield at some fundraising gala. The conflict of interest was so obvious it barely seemed worth mentioning. "Your nursing references don't check out," Medina said, sliding a printout across the desk. The paper landed with the weight of a verdict. "Atlanta General has no employment record for you. Your supervisor doesn't exist. Your phone number is registered to a telecommunications dead drop used for fraudulent activity." Rachel's jaw remained steady. Her hands lay folded on her lap with the calm of someone who'd faced worse than administrative questioning in much warmer climates. "I understand. We need to know who you actually are. You already know I'm a nurse. You've seen me work." Medina's face hardened. "You submitted false credentials to gain employment at a medical facility. That's a felony. We're required to report this to state licensing, the FBI, and potentially the Department of Justice. You have approximately 90 minutes before security escorts you from the building. Whatever this is, whatever you've been doing here, it ends today." The words arrived in the cold, matter-of-fact tone of someone delivering a termination that had already been decided 3 time zones away. There was no negotiation in her voice, no room for explanation. This was power deployed without the inconvenience of human consideration. Rachel stood without being asked to leave, moved toward the door with the same steady precision she'd maintained through her entire tenure at Cedar Creek. "I need to pick up something from my locker. Security will escort you. Collect only personal items. No patient files, no documentation, no equipment." The walk to the locker room felt longer than it should have, or perhaps it simply felt longer because she was acutely aware of it being her last walk through these corridors. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their constant electronic murmur, the same lights that had illuminated her nights reading medication records, the same ceiling that had witnessed her transformation from temp worker to undercover operator to exposed fraud. She opened her locker, number 247, which she'd committed to memory along with a dozen other details that no longer mattered, and removed her personal items. A coffee tumbler. A sweater. The photograph of her son at his last school, before the moves, before the assignments, before she'd promised him stability. At the bottom of the locker, beneath everything else, sat the pair of worn combat boots. She'd meant to keep them hidden, meant to leave them, but her hands moved of their own accord, muscle memory that hadn't erased itself just because her mission had been compromised. She stuffed them into the gym bag beneath her sweater, gambling that security would be thorough enough to escort her but not so thorough as to search a nurse's personal effects. The security guard, an older man named Deshaun who'd always nodded at her in the hallways, walked her to the employee entrance without speaking. At 0905, her badge was deactivated at the door. The electronic lock disengaged with a click that sounded like finality. She was no longer an employee of Cedar Creek Medical. No longer a nurse in the system. No longer anything at this hospital but a person being asked to leave. The parking lot sprawled before her, nearly empty at this hour, the morning sun already hot on the asphalt. She sat in her car for 7 minutes with the engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel, aware that her 8-year-old son was at school waiting for her to pick him up at 15:30 like she always did, unaware that his mother had just become unemployable, that the job which was supposed to give them stability had collapsed in 90 minutes of administrative efficiency. The apartment they were renting would need to be vacated. The school enrollment would need to be withdrawn. The routine she'd built would need to be dismantled again, packed into boxes again, loaded into a car bound for somewhere else again. She was reaching for her phone to call her commanding officer when the alert came through her classified device, not text, not email, but an actual notification that bypassed all normal channels. General Vincent Hayes, the patient she'd been sent to protect, the man whose medication care she'd been documenting, the reason her entire life was currently imploding, had shown early warning signs of acute cardiac distress. Her hands froze on the steering wheel. She looked back at the hospital entrance, at the glass doors that had just locked her out, at the building that no longer wanted her but still contained her patient, a patient she could no longer access, no longer monitor, no longer protect because a man with a phone and institutional backing had systematically dismantled every credential she needed to do her job. The notification continued to pulse on her screen, and Rachel Torres sat alone in her car in a Philadelphia parking lot at 0910 in the morning, understanding with absolute clarity that the worst part of this operation wasn't that she'd been caught. It was that she'd been caught exactly when the person she'd been sent to save needed her the most, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it from a parking lot. General Hayes's monitor showed the electrical alternance pattern at 0303, the distinctive flattening of the QRS complex that only meant one thing. Fluid. Crushing. His heart was running out of room. Rachel stood in the doorway of room 347 in violation of her suspension, her deactivated badge code somehow still recognized by a system that hadn't yet updated, and she'd made the drive from her apartment to Cedar Creek in 14 minutes, hitting 89 miles per hour on the Schuylkill Expressway, drawn by the pulsing alert on her classified phone the way a shark follows blood in dark water. The on-call cardiothoracic surgeon was 20 minutes out, stuck behind a jackknifed semi-truck on Route 76. Hayes had 12 minutes before his blood pressure collapsed entirely. The monitor beeped its accelerating rhythm, heart rate climbing toward 140, and Rachel's hands were already moving, muscle memory taking over, reaching for the pericardiocentesis kit before her conscious mind had fully registered what her eyes were seeing. The subxiphoid approach. Needle angled 45 degrees toward the left shoulder. She'd done this 4 times in field conditions, twice without ultrasound, once while a Navy SEAL held a combat casualty steady on a bouncing Black Hawk over Kandahar. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm as she laid out the sterile field, her movements precise as a surgeon's laser, when the door burst open and Dr. Whitfield materialized in wrinkled scrubs, his face flushed with the particular rage of a man who'd been called at 0300 and discovered his problems weren't dead yet. They were standing at his patient's bedside with a needle. "Step away from that patient." His voice cut like shattered glass. "You're not even supposed to be in this building." Rachel didn't look up. Her eye stayed on Hayes's neck, finding the anatomical landmarks that would guide her needle. "He has 12 minutes before cardiac arrest. The surgeon is 20 out." Whitfield moved toward her with the confidence of a man who'd never been refused in his life. His hand came down on her shoulder, not a gentle gesture, a control move, the kind of physical dominance he'd perfected through 20 years of hierarchy and deference. "You're a temp nurse with fraudulent credentials, not a physician. If you touch him, it's assault on a patient." Rachel didn't resist. She let his grip hold for exactly 2 seconds, feeling where his weight concentrated, where his leverage depended entirely on her cooperation. Then her body moved, not with violence, with physics, a controlled rotation through the shoulder joint that looked like a stumble, looked like she'd simply twisted away from him, made it look accidental enough that when she repositioned herself at Hayes's bedside, Whitfield's brain didn't quite register that she'd just applied a joint lock that could have separated his shoulder if she'd wanted to. She'd chosen not to. Restraint was its own kind of power. The needle went in at the subxiphoid space, angled precisely toward the left shoulder, and she felt the resistance change as it pierced the fibrous pericardium, a distinct pop, barely perceptible, the way a surgeon's hands learn to feel the difference between tissue and failure. 60 milliliters of bloody fluid came back in the syringe, the color of rust and old blood, the exact color she remembered from a forward operating base in Helmand Province where a Marine had been breathing fluid instead of air, and she'd been the only one who understood that the fix was mechanical, not chemical. Hayes's blood pressure climbed from 70/40 to 95/60 in 90 seconds. The monitor's rhythm steadied. His eyes opened, consciousness returning like a light switch, awareness flooding back as his heart found room to beat, as oxygenated blood found its way to his brain. He saw Rachel, registered her presence, his general's mind still sharp enough to recognize something had shifted in the room. Whitfield was already moving toward the door, already pulling his phone from his pocket, his composure fracturing like thin ice under pressure. "Security," he said into the phone. "Now. Room 347. And get hospital administration." He made a second call before his first one finished ringing. Rachel heard him dialing, heard the beginning of his explanation to someone with institutional power before she'd even disposed of the needle. Then a third call, his voice dropping lower, speaking to someone who picked up despite the hour, speaking to his medical school contact at the state licensing board, laying out the narrative he'd constructed, fraudulent credentials, practicing outside scope, endangering a patient through unauthorized procedures. By the time security arrived at 0312, the story was already in motion. They found Rachel standing beside the bed, her hands clean, her badge already removed from her pocket and placed on the bedside table, a small gesture of compliance that made the escorting easier. The security officer was a woman named Chen who'd always nodded when Rachel passed in the corridors, who now couldn't quite meet her eyes as she said, "I'm sorry, but I have to ask you to come with me." Not aggressive. Not cruel. Just the machinery of an institution protecting itself. Rachel followed without argument, her classified phone heavy in her pocket, the USB drive with 18 weeks of medication records and prescription override still secured in the sole of her left shoe where security would never think to look. By 0600, 3 separate complaints had been filed with 3 separate agencies. By 0800, Cedar Creek's legal team had reviewed the video from the hallway camera and confirmed that Rachel had entered the building without authorization during a formal suspension. By 0905, her badge was deactivated, her locker cleared by an escort, her personnel file flagged with a notation that would follow her for years, practicing medicine without a license. Fraudulent credentials. Terminated for cause. The escort walked her through the main entrance as morning shift nurses arrived, their eyes following her in complete silence, the kind of silence that carried weight, that acknowledged without words that something had fundamentally shifted, that the hierarchy everyone had accepted wasn't as stable as it seemed. Rachel drove home in her 2008 Honda Civic with 147,000 miles on the odometer, her classified phone sitting in the center console between coffee cups and old receipts, looking like it belonged to someone ordinary. By 10:47 she was at her kitchen table, staring at the phone, understanding with complete precision that her commanding officer would call soon, that the mission was blown, that 18 weeks of undercover work had accomplished exactly nothing except the thing she'd never intended. She'd saved General Vincent Hayes's life. And now she was unemployed with a destroyed cover and a son who came home from half-day school at 11:15 expecting his mother to be at work. He found her at the table, not crying, but close enough that her eyes were still damp from the effort of not crying, and his small voice asked, "Mom, why are you home?" The question landed like a bullet because he was supposed to stay enrolled in Philadelphia public schools this year. He was supposed to finally have a full school year in one place instead of moving every 4 months following her assignments, and she'd promised him this job would be different. "Sometimes jobs don't work out the way we plan," she said, and saw his expression shift, the understanding settling over his 8-year-old face that the moving was starting again, that the promises were breaking again, that nothing ever stayed. The sound hit them at 1143 exactly, not a sound, a pressure wave, the thud of rotor blades that turned the apartment windows into vibrating glass and made the dishes in the cabinet rattle with the frequency of a 60 Hz hum amplified by 1,000. 2 military helicopters, their rotors still spinning, settling onto the street outside her building with the controlled violence of trained pilots doing impossible things. Her son's eyes went wide. "Mom, what's—" 5 transport vehicles pulled up in perfect formation. 50 Marines in dress blues emerged in the kind of synchronized motion that only came from repeated practice and institutional discipline. They formed a corridor from the lead vehicle to her building's entrance, standing at parade rest, their faces forward, their bearing that particular combination of respect and lethal competence that marked the difference between soldiers and decoration. Rachel stood slowly, moving to the window, her mind processing information faster than her body could follow. The rotor wash shook the entire building. The lead Marine was already at her door, boots on tile, and when she opened it he saluted, a sharp crisp movement, fist to chest, and said in a voice trained to carry across parade grounds, "Master Chief Petty Officer Torres, you're needed immediately. General Hayes is requesting your presence." She returned the salute without hesitation, the movement automatic as breathing, and saw her son's face transform, confusion giving way to the beginning of understanding that his mother was not what he believed, that the woman he saw every day was the surface of something deeper, something that made Marines salute and helicopters shake apartment buildings at midday on a Tuesday. As Rachel descended to the street, her neighbors emerging onto their porches like an audience understanding that something momentous was happening, a man in his 60s stepped forward from the crowd, Morrison, Cedar Creek's veteran security guard, an old Army Ranger who'd followed the convoy. He raised his voice to carry across the block, across the growing crowd of civilians filming on their phones, across the Marines who remained at perfect attention. "Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres," Morrison said. "Navy Special Warfare Combat Medic. 3 deployed combat tours." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that held weight, that acknowledged everything unspoken, that made the morning air itself seem to pause. General Vincent Hayes stepped from the lead vehicle wearing his Class A dress uniform, the forecatheter still taped to his arm exactly where Rachel had placed it 6 hours earlier. He carried a leather folder containing documents that told a story entirely different from the one Cedar Creek Medical had constructed. He moved toward Rachel with the bearing of a man accustomed to commanding thousands, and when he opened the folder his voice carried across the street like it was carrying across a battlefield. "Silver Star," he said, his eyes on Rachel but his words for the crowd. "Combat Medical Action Under Fire. Helmand Province, 2009. 1 second of pause. A breath. A moment for weight to settle. Silver Star," he continued. "Extracting for wounded personnel through direct enemy fire while coordinating close air support. Sanjin Valley, 2010. The moment stretched. 100 civilians watching. 50 Marines at attention. A morning sun climbing over Philadelphia's skyline. Navy Cross, Hayes said, and his voice dropped lower, which made it carry farther. Actions in Marja, August 2010. For Marines extracted to safety. 17 additional lives saved through Master Chief's coordination of air support. Actions taken while suffering shrapnel wounds to right leg and left shoulder. Dr. Whitfield stood at the edge of the crowd, his Audi parked at an angle behind the transport vehicles, his face registering the moment his narrative collapsed entirely, his jaw working, his color draining away like someone understanding too late that the hierarchy he'd built was made of paper and spite. Rachel stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, her breathing controlled, her face revealing nothing. This was how a warrior received recognition, not with emotion, but with the composure of someone who'd already survived far worse than public acknowledgement. The rotor blades were the first thing she heard, a sound like thunder learning to hover, so powerful it rattled the windows in their frames. Rachel stood in her living room, perfectly still, watching the glass tremor as if the sky itself was descending onto Greenfield Avenue. Her son was at school. The apartment was hers alone. And then there were 50 Marines in dress blues forming a corridor from 5 transport vehicles to her front door, their uniforms crisp as knife edges, their presence transforming a Philadelphia street corner into something that belonged to a different world entirely. The first soldier through the door saluted before he spoke, his arm rising with the precision of someone following orders older than words. "Reaper 6, he said, the call sign landing like recognition, like the part of her that had been folded away for 6 months suddenly given permission to exist again. "You're needed immediately." Rachel didn't move. She didn't need to. The room behind her was already changing, already filling with the geometry of people who knew how to stand, how to wait, how to exist in hierarchies that didn't require explanation. The veteran security guard from Cedar Creek, the one who'd watched her badge get swiped by a nurse supervisor at 0902, stepped through the crowd with something like wonder on his weathered face, his mouth opening to speak words he'd probably never planned to say in his lifetime. "Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres," he announced to the gathering crowd outside, to the neighbors who'd opened windows, to the news van that was already pulling around the corner. Navy Special Warfare. 3 tours. General Vincent Hayes emerged from the lead vehicle, and Rachel's breath changed its pattern, not a gasp, never a gasp, but a deliberate reset of her diaphragm when she saw the 4 catheter still taped to his arm, the fluid line running from her work, from her hands, from the needle she'd driven through his pericardium while Dr. Whitfield screamed at her to step back. The general moved like a man who'd been given hours instead of minutes, his gait steady, his eyes finding hers across the distance like a communications officer locking onto a signal. He held a classified file in his other hand, the kind with red borders and restricted access stamps that turned institutional hierarchy into something quaint and powerless by comparison. 2 silver stars, he read aloud, his voice carrying across the street with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in rooms filled with people twice his rank. The folder opened like an indictment of every assumption Dr. Whitfield had ever made about the woman in scrubs who kneeled to pick up cafeteria charts. Navy Cross for carrying for wounded Marines through enemy fire in Marja while directing A-10 Warthog close air support runs on your position. His eyes lifted from the page. While directing them. While bleeding. While making sure your people made it home. Rachel's jaw remained perfectly level. Her hand stayed at her sides. The composure wasn't a choice anymore, it was armor that had been welded to her 6 months ago when she'd walked into Cedar Creek Medical with a falsified resume and a mission no one could know about. Deep cover investigation into medication discrepancies, Hayes continued, still reading, still holding the documents like he was explaining something to himself as much as to the crowd. 2 veteran patients deceased. Lethal drug interactions. Standing orders that prevented nurses from applying clinical judgment. Standing orders that trace directly to Dr. Marcus Whitfield's written protocols. A Marine aide stepped forward carrying something that made Rachel's chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with pain. The worn combat boots, her son's father's boots, scuffed and soft from 17 years in a closet and 1,000 carries between apartments and deployments and grief that was worn smooth like river stone. The same boots she'd held against her chest at 0300 when she was gripping her bathroom sink. "These belong to Major Daniel Torres," Hayes said, and the street went absolutely silent, the kind of silence that happens when the world recognizes it's holding something sacred. "Killed in Marja protecting my position. You turned down a promotion to lieutenant commander to work this assignment personally. You turned down advancement to ensure that the man responsible for these deaths would be held accountable." The veteran security guard was crying. Rachel could see the tears running down his face without turning her head, could sense them in the same way she sensed heartbeats through a stethoscope, the subtle indicators of things that mattered. She didn't cry. Not here. Not with 50 Marines standing at attention and the street turning into something that looked like vindication. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it accelerated it, compressed it, accelerated it into a sequence of hours that dismantled everything Dr. Whitfield had constructed. At 18:23 hours, a pharmacy technician named Angela Price was scrolling through her social media feed when the viral video of a woman in a dress blue uniform being publicly honored by the United States Marine Corps triggered a memory. 3 days earlier, she'd recorded Dr. Whitfield deliberately knocking a nurse's meal tray to the floor in the Cedar Creek cafeteria, had shot it as gossip material, had laughed about it with her shift partner. The video showed everything: the theatrical bump of his elbow, the smirk, the tray hitting tile with the unmistakable sound of something breaking, soup spreading like a stain across the floor, and the woman kneeling in absolute silence while 3 residents watched and grinned. In the comments under the viral video, someone had identified the insignia on Rachel's uniform. In the next comments, someone had identified her rank. In the next wave, people who'd worked at Cedar Creek had started identifying Dr. Whitfield by name. Angela Price watched the cafeteria footage 3 times and made a choice that changed everything. She uploaded it. By 1847, the video had 40,000 shares. By 2100, medical ethics accounts were reposting it. By evening broadcast, local Philadelphia news was running it with the headline "Decorated Navy Officer Humiliated by Physician Before Heroic Rescue." At 1820 that same evening, a retired Army colonel named Patricia Hendricks was having dinner with her own veteran son when she saw the video pop up in her social feed. She'd written Dr. Marcus Whitfield's recommendation for his Cedar Creek position. She'd vouched for his character to the hospital board. She'd considered him her greatest educational success, the resident who understood discipline and excellence and the importance of hierarchy. She watched the video once. Twice. 3 times. Then she saw the comments identifying the woman as Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, Navy Special Warfare, and something inside her shifted, a tectonic movement of recognition, a moment when she understood she'd been wrong about a man in the same way most people are wrong about people who hide cruelty behind competence. By 1900, Colonel Hendricks had drafted a public statement to the Pennsylvania Medical Board. By 1930, it was posted. By 0900 the next morning, the medical board had opened a formal investigation. The statement itself was a tactical strike, 23 sentences listing her credentials, her years of service, her military rank, and her formal withdrawal of professional support for Dr. Marcus Whitfield. She documented seeing the video, seeing the deliberate cruelty, and recognizing that she'd made an error in judgment so significant that she needed to correct it publicly, permanently, irrevocably. The statement included a request for a full review of his patient care decisions and supervisory conduct, which triggered a secondary investigation into the 2 deceased veterans and the medication orders that hadn't been questioned because they'd come from someone with institutional authority to be unquestioned. Cedar Creek's administrator, suddenly aware that his former residency colleague had created massive liability, placed Dr. Whitfield on immediate suspension by 0930. By 1100, the nursing staff who'd witnessed the cafeteria incident were being interviewed one by one. Rachel's USB drive, the evidence she'd compiled across 6 months, every flagged concern, every overridden nurse recommendation, every patient note that documented the dangerous protocol, was now in the hands of both NCIS and the medical board. The pattern emerged with the precision of something that had been waiting to be seen. Whitfield's standing orders prevented nurses from adjusting medications based on patient-specific factors, renal function that affected drug clearance, age-related metabolism changes, documented drug interactions that textbooks warned about. His protocols prioritized his authority over their clinical judgment. In the cases of the two deceased veterans, nurses had flagged concerns that were systematically overridden by his written policies. One nurse, terrified of retaliation, had documented her objections in personal notes that she now submitted as evidence, her handwriting shaking on the page. By the end of that week, the Pennsylvania Medical Board revoked Dr. Marcus Whitfield's medical license pending criminal investigation for negligent homicide. Cedar Creek Medical terminated his employment, removed his name from every award, every building dedication, every honor roll they'd ever printed. His mentor's public disavowal, made not in a closed boardroom but in a public statement to the media, destroyed his reputation in the medical community so thoroughly that malpractice defense firms wouldn't return his calls. Professional colleagues who defended him through his career suddenly became silent. Medical journals that had published his research stopped listing his name in their mastheads. 6 days later, Rachel stood in General Vincent Hayes's hospital room wearing her lieutenant commander insignia, the bars newly pinned to her uniform by the general himself, his hand steady now, his cardiac function restored, his for long since removed. Her son was holding the worn combat boots, her son who finally understood why they moved so often, why his mother kept those boots in her closet like a prayer, why some sacrifices looked like ordinary days but meant everything that mattered. 50 Marines stood at attention in the hallway outside because the room itself could only fit 12. Hayes told her that her investigation had triggered system-wide policy reviews at 17 military treatment facilities and 42 VA hospitals where similar physician override protocols had been creating dangerous care gaps. The two veteran patients whose deaths had set this entire sequence in motion, both Marines, both from Hayes's command in different eras, would be honored in a ceremony where their families would meet Rachel and thank her through tears for ensuring that their deaths led to changes that would protect others. Cedar Creek Medical offered Rachel a permanent position as clinical director of veteran services at a salary 4 times what she'd made as a temp nurse. She declined, returning to active NCIS duty with a commendation and a new assignment training combat medics in institutional investigation techniques. And Dr. Marcus Whitfield, unable to practice medicine, unhireable in hospital administration after his mentor's public disavowal, took a position teaching CPR fundamentals at a Philadelphia community college for $18 per hour. His classroom was a windowless basement space where students scrolled their phones through his lectures and walked out when they recognized him from viral videos. By the second week, his class size had dropped from 24 to 7. Rachel never spoke to him again. Never acknowledged his existence. Never gave him the dignity of her attention. But 6 months later, she was giving a lecture on medical ethics at Naval Medical Center Bethesda when a student asked how she'd maintained her composure during her Cedar Creek assignment. She paused, thought of kneeling on cafeteria tile and bathroom sinks gripped until her knuckles went white, and said, "True class is what you do when the lights go out, when no one's watching, when there's no recognition coming, when the only person who knows your choices is you." Her son, sitting in the back of the lecture hall for Bring Your Family Day, recognized his father's boots displayed on the podium and understood for the first time what his mother chose to protect, and why. If this story about hidden heroes and institutional corruption resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to know that quiet strength and sacrifice don't require applause to matter. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?